What I'm going to talk about today is actually kind of a different presentation than my last two WMD presentations. But before I jump into it, all these slides are going to be available at this URL, coelevate.com/WMD16. So don't feel like you need to scribble a bunch of notes. It's all going to be there. I'd prefer you just kind of sit here and pay attention. So what I want to talk about today is that, interesting that this presentation is coming after Nir's talk, because I think our industry of growth and customer acquisition, we've got an addiction. We've got a really bad addiction, right? And that addiction is to this need around searching for this one tip and trick and hack and tool and tactic that's going to like cause an explosion of growth in our business, right? And if this sounds familiar, it should, because this was the start of my presentation 2 years ago and last year, right? And again, but I'm going to talk about this in a little bit of a different angle. And the reason I think it's an addiction and a problem is because these tactics are basically prescriptions. They're trying to prescribe the solution to all of our growth problems. And as we know with prescriptions, they're good in small doses every now and then to help fix some problems. But when we regularly take them, it never solves the underlying problem. And so my urging to you is just say no, right? Just say no to all of these tips. They're good in small doses, right? But what we need to really be focusing 80% of our time on are other types of things that I want to talk about today. So there's kind of one problem with this, right, with these prescriptions. And the big problem with it is that problem solving really requires new approaches. And by definition, a prescription is not going to be a new approach. We learn the most and we create the most value by solving unsolved problems, right? So when we face our companies, right, once again, when we're facing a problem, the unsolved problems tend to be where we unlock the most growth, both personally and professionally, for our companies and our products. And while this presentation is mostly oriented towards people on teams, individual contributors, I also want leaders and managers who might be listening to this to also pay attention, because I firmly believe that it is the managers and the leaders' jobs of today to help facilitate the right things and train the next crop of future marketers and growth and customer acquisition experts. So today what I'm going to walk through is 5 of 7. I couldn't fit all of them. Things that I wish I knew when I started my career. And so, I'm not saying, I have a long way to go myself in terms of growing and learning around this subject. It is absolutely a continual process. But I want to make sure that nobody else kind of makes the same mistakes that I did and really can build off of the things that I feel like I've learned along the way. The way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to walk through a timeline. I'm not going to bore you with kind of the really early days of birth, but I'm going to walk you through the timeline of my career and the huge lessons at every single step of the way. And where I'm going to start is college. So I was lucky. I went to the University of Michigan, a great college. Go Blue, by the way. And, while I was in college, right, I was a pretty diligent student, but I had my fun too. And this is a picture of me holding a fully grown man on my shoulders after losing a game called Wizard Staff, so I don't recommend it anymore. But while having fun, I was also pretty good on the GPA, right? I worked really hard to get a GPA, and the reason was because all through kind of middle school and high school, I was trained that the GPA was the most important thing, right? That's what got me into University of Michigan in the first place. And so when I got there, I kept pursuing that same goal. I got to get the same GPA. And so what that ended up causing was basically I ended up loading half of my classes with easy classes to kind of keep my GPA high. It was a really big mistake. But luckily along the way, thankfully, I also started a bunch of different projects. I started a social network called Party Campus. I was uniquely qualified, as you could see from the previous photo. Family, which was another social network, and the blog. And the reason I say I'm lucky to start this is because these 3 things led to 3 really important other things. I learned 10x more than any other class. I created something of value. And most interestingly, because of these 3 things, nothing I did in my classwork, I got my first job. And so my first lesson was that basically we're moving to a world where credentials don't matter anymore. They still matter a little bit, but they're getting less and less appropriate over time. And the reason is, and a proof point of this is really interesting, is that the SVP of Ops at Google, probably one of the best hiring organizations in the world, right? They did a bunch of studies, and they found that the pedigree of the college education told them nothing about how they were going to be successful at Google. And so they actually got rid of it during their screening process. And I think the reason is because our work is becoming more transparent. With tools like GitHub, Dribbble, Behance, SlideShare, Medium, Squarespace, it is so much easier to take what we've done, the work, our actual outcomes, our actual accomplishments, and put them out there in the world. And that is fundamentally more important than any credential that you will ever receive. And so the first lesson that I wanted to share is focus on accomplishments, not credentials. Moving on, my first job out of college was at a company called ZoomInfo. It's in Boston. It's still around today. I was hired as a product manager. The manager found me from my blog. And starting out, I was a terrible employee. By all measures of the equation, I was terrible. I would have fired my own ass if I was my manager at that time. And my manager told me as much. He pulled me aside and told me I was doing a terrible job. It was a pretty strong dose from the get-go. And it wasn't because I didn't work hard, but it was because I didn't know what I was doing. I entered into a situation where all of the projects that basically ended up on my lap, I just didn't know how to do any of it. And so one thing that I started thinking about, and I've learned in hindsight, is that all of our work lives on a spectrum. It lives on this spectrum where on one hand, we have 100% known. These are projects that are 100% known, meaning that they're based on safe skills that we've already mastered. On the other end of the spectrum, we have 100% of the unknown, and these are completely new skills in completely new terrain. So there's problems with this. It's kind of where do we want to place ourselves on the spectrum to focus on learning and maximize progression around our subject of growth and any subject. The issue with being too far on the left hand of the spectrum is that if we're 100% in the known, it's boring, right? We get really, really bored because we're not progressing. Or if we're not getting bored, right, and we're just doing a bunch of safe stuff, we're not actually learning. We fall into this routine. And the problem with that is that our world, right, our world of marketing is changing so fast, right, we can become obsolete extremely quickly. The right hand of the spectrum was where I was at the beginning of ZoomInfo. The projects that I had started with were completely new skills and terrain. I knew nothing about what the heck I was doing, right? And what that just leads to is a bunch of frustration. It's hard to get any progress forward at all, as much as possible. And so what I learned here, and what my manager at the time realized and was really good with, is that, I skipped this, is that the quickest learners kind of relate the new to the known, right? And so what that means is we need to be somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. We don't want to be too far on the right hand of the spectrum. We always want to be kind of partially in the known, partially in the unknown, because that way we can kind of build off of the foundation of things that we already know, and also be spending a good part of our time on the things that we don't know yet, which is what actually causes learning. So the big lesson from ZoomInfo is that always find yourself 1 foot in the known, 1 foot in the unknown. You got to get really good at recognizing when you're on the ends of the spectrum and figure out ways to move yourself back somewhere towards the middle. After ZoomInfo, I basically started my first venture-backed company. It was called Viximo. It was during the social gaming boom of the Facebook platform and Farmville and all those crazy times. And when I started that company, I was probably 23 years old. We raised a bunch of venture capital. I had a couple co-founders, and I needed to be a Swiss Army knife, right? That is the point, or that is a huge role of a founder right in the early days. Is I was doing all sorts of things. I was doing customer acquisition. I was doing product. I was doing BD. I was doing sales. I was doing all of these things. But as we found some success and the company started to grow pretty quickly, probably at about 15, 16 employees, I realized that I needed to kind of turn into a laser. And that generalist, that Swiss Army knife nature of it, right, started to be way less valuable to the company. And I also found that I was not only adding less value to the company, but I wasn't growing as much myself either. And so what I realized at this time, and what this turned into, was basically one of my most popular blog posts, was that you probably heard this advice before, which is shape yourself like a T, right? Basically have a broad set of skills at the top, and then go really, really deep on something. But since I published that post, I found that actually most people misinterpret this. And so I want to clarify this about what shaping yourself like a T actually means. And it has two parts. The first is master the fundamentals. And I'm going to read this real quick. This is from a book called The 5 Elements of Effective Thinking. And the quote in the book, the author is telling a story, and he says he's telling a story about Tony Blogg. He's a super famous composer and trumpet player. He said, during the class, each student played a portion of his or her selected piece. They played wonderfully. Tony then gave very easy warm-up exercise that any beginning trumpet player might be given. Super, super easy. After they played that simple phrase, Tony, for the first time during the lesson, picked up the trumpet. He played that same phrase, but when he played it, it wasn't childish, it was exquisite. Each note was rich, delightful sound. The student's attempt did not even come close. The contrast was astounding, right? So it's interesting here. The reason I bring up this story is because the difference between the student and the master here had nothing to do with this very complex piece that they had. It had everything to do with this super, super simple fundamental, which was this simple exercise. And the reason mastering the fundamentals is so important is because the fundamentals build your foundation, right? They contribute to being able to be getting good at anything within your profession, right? The second thing is that mastering the fundamentals never ends, right? Most people think they just scratch the surface. They just learn a little bit about user psychology or a little bit about data analysis, right? But 20, 30 years into your career, understanding the nuances, going deeper on these fundamentals is still learning, just like Tony was when he was 30 years into his music career. The third is that fundamentals and growth are not channel related, right? So it doesn't matter. It's not SEO. It's not about virality. It's not about Facebook ads. It's not about content marketing. They are completely different. And so I was trying to think about exactly what the fundamentals were, and I kind of have a draft for this, and I'm sure I'll refine this over time. But I think the fundamentals in growth right now are 4 things. And they mix between quantitative and qualitative. In the lower left-hand corner, what we have is data analysis. Data analysis is all about understanding the meaning of data, what your users have been doing historically, and extracting insights out of that. But data analysis isn't actually worth anything unless you can put it into practice. And the best way to put it into practice is getting really, really good at building forward-looking quantitative models, right? The forward-looking quantitative model is actually what's going to be helping you make decisions about should I do X, should I do Y? Is channel Z going to actually have a big impact, right? Is our retention good enough to keep our growth going 3 to 6 months? How do we prioritize our resources? All of these different things. On the qualitative end of the spectrum, in the lower right-hand corner, we have user psychology. So actually understanding the motivations around your user problem and your value problem. A lot of what Nir was talking about. But once again, we can't just understand, right? We need to put it into practice. And the way we put that into practice is through storytelling, right? We bring those motivations to life through features, through copy, through landing pages, through emails, all of these other ways. These are the fundamentals of our profession right now. Has nothing to do with SEO tricks or the latest Facebook ad, Google algorithm change, right? We need to master these 4 things, and if we do master these 4 things, the better we understand these things, we'll be able to pick up all of those channel-related things, and as the ecosystem changes, we'll be able to adapt with it. The second part of shaping yourself like a T is to go deep. And this is the typical resume I get when I put something out there and I hire. Somebody says, well, I know SEO, I know content, I know CRO, I know retention, I know Facebook ads, I know Pinterest ads, I know HTML and virality. I'm like, man, oh, and by the way, that person's only 2 years out of college. And I'm like, this guy, man, he must be a baller, right? He just knows everything. But inevitably, what you find out is that these people, most of these resumes, they're basically okay at a lot of things, but they're excellent at nothing. And I think being okay at a lot of things is far less valuable than being amazing at one thing. And the reason is, when you go deep and you become amazing at one thing, it forces you to solve problems with unknown answers, right? When you scratch beyond the surface, and you run into a problem on anything that you're working on that you can't get on some blog post with a quick Google search, you're solving an unknown problem. And that's, once again, where most of the growth happens and where we create the most value. The second thing is that value rises exponentially the deeper we go, right? Because we start, it's really, really easy to learn the basics. Anybody can do that. But when we go really deep, we start putting ourselves in a bucket of people where there's less and less people. We stand out more and more, and as a result, our value rises exponentially. And the third is that if we get great at one thing, it is way easier to become great at another. And the reason is because we're learning how to learn. We're learning how to go beyond the basics. We're learning how to get beyond the surface. So the big thing here, once again, I want to rephrase shaping yourself like a T and say continually master the basics and go deep. At this point, after Viximo, I started another company named Boundless. But most recently, before I started Reforge, I was a VP of growth at HubSpot. And this was the first time that I was in a really, really large organization. And I got to the really interesting thing that is I got to observe a lot of different peoples and a lot of different professions basically choosing what they were working on. And what I realized, kind of observing from afar, is that people choose things based on a lot of most of the time through their internal motivations, what motivates them personally. And we're all motivated by different things. Some people are motivated by the most technically challenging product or project. Some are motivated by the most creative project. Some are motivated by basically having autonomy and something that they can own themselves, right? There's a bunch of different motivations. But the funny thing is, as I saw these people kind of working on projects, I compared them to the people in the organization that rose through the ladder way faster than anybody else, and I found some really interesting differences. And that was that they tended to make decisions based on this 2x2 matrix. On the x-axis, we have the popularity of the project. So on the left, it's a low popularity. On the right, it's high popularity. And on the y-axis, I have the impact of the project, low to high, right? So in the lower left-hand corner, low impact, low popularity, right? You would never choose those projects. Those are the projects that are typically given to the interns, right? On the right hand, in the lower right-hand question, it's like super high popularity, low impact. This is what I call glamour projects, right? They might have like a lot of exposure. They might be really sexy, and that's why people want to work on them. But they actually, when you really think about it, they probably have low impact on the business. But now we get really interesting. What about high impact, high impact, high popularity. Sorry, I used my phrasing wrong. But the sexy projects in the upper right-hand corner. And these are the projects that everybody wants to work on. Like every single person wants to work on, right? And so it's really hard for you individually, right, to have a really big impact since everybody wants their kind of hands in the mix. So the thing that I realized about the people at HubSpot that really rose through the ladder was that they occupied the upper left-hand corner. They chose the really messy, the really hard, but yet really important and high-impact projects. And they're low popularity because they're messy, hard, and important. And the reason that position themselves so well is a few things. The first is that they learn a lot. Those projects tend to be incredibly challenging, and so as a result, if you basically learn the more challenging the project is. The second thing is that they end up positioning themselves as a rare expert on a very high impact, important thing within the company. And so to give you an example of something like this, a project like this might be, how do we basically reconstruct sales comp for a 300-person sales team and implement Salesforce in a way that tracks everything to the T, right? Man, sounds terrible, right? But really freaking important, right? Really important within the company. And these messy projects basically require you to get a really deep level of understanding on a really important topic, and so you become the expert on this topic, and everybody wants that person on their team, right? Which brings me to the third point. You make yourself visible. These projects tend to have really high visibility in the org, right? And so you're seen as a leader, almost a savior, that you're the one tackling this big, messy thing. So when possible, choose high-impact, low-popularity projects. All right, this brings me to Reforge and what I'm working on today. And so every single year, this is not a picture of me, I wish it was me, but every single year I'd kind of take a retreat and I kind of basically evaluate the past year and ask myself a bunch of questions kind of personally, professionally, do some nerdy goal setting, all that fun stuff. But there's one question that I ask myself every year, and that's what are the 20% of activities that lead to 80% of the value creation? And now that I've done this for a number of years, probably about 6 years now, there's only one thing that has been in that bucket every single year. And that was my blog, my very simple blog. And what I realized is that I got hired at ZoomInfo because of my blog. I met my first VCs, the people who wrote me a $5 million check on 2 pieces of paper. They were dumb to do it, but they did it anyways, from my blog. Boundless met my VCs and my investors through that. And Reforge, what I'm working on today, is 100% enabled by my blog. So the lesson of this is not to write a blog, but the lesson is that as you go through your career, build and be a platform. This is probably the highest value thing that you can do. So going back to that very first lesson, which is focusing on output, accomplishments, right? You need a way to distribute those accomplishments and those outcomes and get some eyeballs on it. And the reason for this is a few things. One is that when we do this, opportunities flow to you. So rather than you scraping and trying to seek out all of these opportunities, all of these options start to be piled onto your plate. And then you're in a much better position if you can be picking and choosing rather than trying to constantly be selling yourself. The second thing, because of that, is you create leverage, right? So as you basically build and be a platform, you move your leverage point to the right so that you can have a really small, you can do something really small and have a really high impact. To give you an example, the way that we started Reforge, all I did was send one email out to my blog subscribers, and we had enough people in the program to basically fund the company for the next 2 years, right? So something really small having a really big impact, but as you, once again, build and be that platform, you're increasing leverage. And last but not least, you end up building a brand, right? And we always talk about brand in the context of companies and how powerful it is and the advantage that companies have when they build really big brands. Well, all of those same lessons actually apply to you personally as well, right? And so as you build this platform, you end up being a brand. So I just want to review real quick, right? 1, focus on accomplishments over credentials. 2, balance the known with the unknown. 3, master the basics and go deep. 4, work on high-impact, low-popularity projects when you can. And 5, be a platform. And so my last note is that we're trying to instill these principles in Reforge. We're trying to help train the next crop of really awesome growth practices. We have a bunch of Reforge alum actually in the audience today. And so if you're really interested, I would really love you guys to join the Reforge community. We'll be running our next program in January. You can go to the site and sign up. And last but not least, I'll leave this up here. So if you want the slides for this presentation, feel free to go to CoElevate, and then I'll be taking some questions. We'll give that a little bit of time. Does we have any audience questions? Well, okay, let's see. All right, what would you recommend to an early stage founder struggling with growth marketing? 1, become elite at growth. 2, hire someone who is elite at growth. 3, your recommendation. So I actually think, well, it depends on your current skill set. But I actually, one of the questions I get is around like founder and becoming managers. And I think one of the best ways to become a founder, the best founders, the best leaders, the best managers actually are an expert in something first. Right? So you look at like the founders of Airbnb or Stripe or even like Zuckerberg at Facebook. They went really, really deep on some kind of subject, whether it was design or engineering or something else. And so the best path to becoming a really valuable founder is actually become really, really good at something yourself first, right? But once you get into that role, typically over time, you need to become a generalist. There's so many things on your plate, like that is your job as the founder. And so you need to hire somebody who's good. But when you hire somebody, once again, don't hire a generalist. The best thing that you could do is basically find somebody who has gotten really, really good at something, become an expert in something. Hopefully that aligns with the channel you want to use, ideally. But if not, it's basically the second best scenario, because if they got really good at something at one channel, be able to become really good at another thing. Any other questions? How long do you think it takes to become an expert at something? How do you know? Like not as long as most people think. So when I gave a lot of this advice to a lot of my team at HubSpot, it basically ended up in this analysis paralysis for a lot of my younger team members. And the reason is that it felt like a 10-year commitment to them. By like choosing something to go deep on something, it felt like a 10-year commitment. And it's definitely not like that at all. Right? First of all, you can go pretty deep on something with the right amount of focus and the right amount of diligence in like probably like a year to two. Right? If you really, really focus. Most people can't do it in that time frame because they're not focusing. Right? So that's number one. And number two is that most people put the pressure on themselves, once again, that if they choose this thing, it's going to be like a 10-year commitment. And no, like it actually works a little bit more like the scientific method, right? You focus on something for a period, you choose a hypothesis, you focus on something for a period of time, right? You work on some projects, see if you like it, see if you kind of dig into it, and you learn something, and if you don't, then you kind of informs whatever your next hypothesis is about what you want to kind of focus on next, right? So once again, it's not a 10-year commitment. Don't think about that, and it's not like it doesn't take an incredibly long time to become super, super deep on stuff. Come on, which are the last two? You gotta go to my blog to find out. No, the last two was get a coach. And so you hear this advice a lot, like get a mentor. I use a coach, the term coach specifically because coaches, like by definition, like can't play the game for you. And I think a lot of times the big problem with people seeking out mentors and coaches is that they're looking for the answers. And what a really great coach does is actually they don't give you an answer. They just help you get to a better answer than you would on your own. And they typically do that by doing two things, giving you a really unbiased opinion, and the second is asking really, really good questions. And so that was one, and I'm actually blanking on the other one, so you will have to go to my blog to find that one out. All right, hiring tips to find an awesome growth marketer. Is there a Hired.com for growth marketers? No, like Hired actually is, I think has marketers on there now. But no, I think hiring a great marketer, like typically the way that we hire with Reforge is that we put everybody through a screen. What we're doing on the screen is we're looking for kind of horizontal values. What I mean by horizontal values are things like, are they a voracious learner? Are they impact focused? These things that are really important to us, our team. But right after that, if they get past the screen, the rest of the interview process is around them displaying their output in their work to us. So we give them mini projects, or we take some of the work that they've already worked on, some previous projects, and we try to get them to sort of add to it, right? And once again, I really want to see what they are able to accomplish, their actual output. I would rather hire somebody based off of that rather than how good they are at answering interview questions. So my two top performers on my team at HubSpot were terrible interviewers. And going back to the previous point, they didn't come from good colleges either. But I looked at their output of their work, and I hired them solely based on that, and they did freaking amazing, right? So whatever you do when you hire, make sure you're hiring based on seeing their actual work and not on kind of like questions or answers to questions. All right, can you give me an example of your impact at HubSpot? I didn't have any impact at HubSpot. How do you determine your platform? Oh, that's a great question, actually. All right, so, there's so many different mediums now, right? Whether it's blogging or whether it's video or podcasting or whatever it might be. And so I think different people are fit with different mediums, just like different products fit really well with different marketing acquisition channels, right? So, and so my medium is writing. Like I'm a writer. And that's the way that I think the best and learn the most. And this presentation started with, all of my presentations start with a blog article. So, so that's my medium. And so it's more of just like kind of testing and seeing kind of what feels the most natural to you. If some will feel like a struggle, right? So like for me, video is kind of like a little bit of a struggle for me. And so I just feel like a lot more natural in writing. Okay, so hiring. All right, I'll answer can you give me an example? So basically at HubSpot, I joined when we started the sales product division. And it was 6 people when I joined. So we were moving from marketing to sales products. It was 6 people when I started, about 100 people when I left. We grew a product from basically single thousands of users to hundreds of thousands of users. And I can say this now because they've announced it, but from 0 to 10 million ARR in about 18 months. So, but that wasn't really my impact. That was really the team's impact. My job at HubSpot was just to hire and train good people. That was it. All right, one more, and then I think I'm done. So would you pay a growth marketer a base salary or a revenue share? Base salary, 100% sure, 100%. The problem with the revenue share is just, or any type of incentives like that, is that basically, this also is the same question around like growth teams that just over-optimize on metrics, right? And they don't take all of the other things into account. What you actually want this person to be doing is to be taking in a balance of both impact and some of the other things that are harder to quantify, right? So when you actually incentivize them based on something like a revenue share, it leads them in the wrong direction. It puts the wrong motivations in place. You want to hire people who are already impact motivated. That is an inherent motivation to them, right? You don't need to be having to provide an external motivation for them to be impact focused, right? That's just never as strong as having the internal motivation. So yeah, never a revenue share. Always do a base salary and then performance bonuses and stuff. I think that's a different scenario. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much. If you have questions.